I'm Carol Chomsky. I am here with Martha Minow. We are at the Marriott Wardman Park Hotel at the 2020 AALS conference in Washington, D.C. on January 2nd, 2020. There's a lot to talk about your professional career, but I want to start a little further back and ask you to talk a little bit about where you grew up and your family and sort of the environment you grew up in that kind of led to the person you ended up becoming.
Well, sure, but first let me say it's a real pleasure to be here, and especially with you, Carol, because we have known each other a long time.
Yes.
I grew up largely in the Chicago area. My parents were involved in politics, and from a young age, I and my two sisters would go door to door and canvass for candidates, and I just thought that was ordinary. And also, I know now it wasn't so ordinary to have dinner conversations as we did about issues of the day. Both of my parents, who are both alive, which is quite remarkable, remain civic participants, civic leaders. My dad was not only a practicing lawyer, but also involved in politics and in governance activities in many sectors. My mother, very also involved in civic activities. And it was sometime into my career as a law professor that I realized I've sort of put together my parents' careers, law for my dad and focusing on issues of family and social connection for my mother. So two sisters, and both of them have become lawyers. It's not what we had planned, but it does seem to be the family profession, but we all do very, very different things. And that's mostly what happened. There was a 2.5-year period in my early childhood when my father was in the administration of John F. Kennedy, and later, I actually was my history professor in college, said, I seem to have absorbed the ideology of the new frontier. So, you know, early elementary school, yes, that was an important part of my childhood.
So expectation probably pretty high for you and your sisters.
I suppose, but also just a sense of duty. You know, my father, child of immigrants, served in World War II, had a deep sense of appreciation for the country, but also obligation to serve. My mother, similarly, a sense of service, community service, more at the city level. So I think it was really more, I don't think it was about ambition. It was about what are you going to do to make the world better.
And what you mentioned, your sisters are both lawyers,
yes,
too, doing different things. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but
sure,
but it's a sort of a context
sure,
for you as well. So what kind of work do they do?
So my older sister, Nell Minow, is a pioneer in the field of corporate governance, where she helped to invent the idea of shareholder rights and the obligations of institutional shareholders to actually exercise their proxy votes. And that followed a career in the federal government, where she had roles at OMB and Department of Justice and really interesting Environmental Protection Agency. And she also, on the side, has another career, which she's a film critic, and she every week reviews movies, and she combines the two often. And my younger sister was a professional librarian for a long time and later went to law school and is a lawyer for libraries. So I'm the mediator.
I think I've seen Nell's writings in the New Yorker, but about corporate governance, I'll have to look for the movie reviews.
Great.
So sort of skip ahead a little bit to kind of college.
Sure.
Your undergraduate degree is from Michigan, 1975. How did you end up at Michigan?
Well, I am from the Midwest, and I very much identify as a Midwestern, even more now that I don't live there. And I realize, you know, I talk to people that I don't know, and I appreciate the kind of cultural elements of the Midwest. So anyway, University of Michigan seemed to me incredibly exciting because anything I wanted to study was there. And I actually remember saying to friends, I want to go to a place that teaches Serbo-Croatian. And somebody said to me, you want to study Serbo-Croatian? I said, no, I just want to be at a place that teaches Serbo-Croatian. And I did, at one point, visit the Serbo-Croatian class. And then years later, I worked on the post-Yugoslavian issues of peace and coexistence. So kind of ironic.
Stayed with you
Yeah.
at that time. And what, did you have an idea of what you were going to major in, study?
No, it was, I really just thought the whole experience was so fantastic. I loved sitting in on classes that I didn't take. I studied a lot of history. I majored in history, but also philosophy, economics, communications. But I also volunteered early on with a lawyer in legal services, and so I did that for much of my time in college. A wonderful lawyer named Roger Chard, who happened to be blind, and so my role was a little more unusual than a typical undergrad. I did a lot of reading for him and then brainstorming. So, wonderful experience.
And I noticed you also had some interesting summer experiences in. I think in those college years, you were an intern at the Chicago Daily News. You worked for Congressman John Bradamus, House Select Committee on Education, and I think teacher and counselor at the School of Journalism at Northwestern.
Yes.
That's what I mean, I lumped them all together, but those had to be formative experiences in some way. I wonder what stayed with you from those experiences.
I did really think I might be a journalist. I had been a journalist in high school, and so I worked on the Michigan Daily, which is like a big professional newspaper. And I did have the opportunity to go back and teach at Northwestern in their summer journalism program that I had attended as a high school student. I taught there for several summers. And actually, it was the summer I was in Washington as an intern for Congressman John Bradamus, who was the whip for the Democrats. It was Watergate summer. And at that time, I thought, I think I don't want to just be reporting. I think I want to be more directly involved. So then I turned from thinking about journalism as a career to something more, I guess, engaged with politics.
And that would be law when you turned to law, but you went to education
exactly.
first.
So no, I really thought I want to work on school desegregation. That's what I concluded. So I went to graduate school in education, and it happened to be the second year of busing in Boston. And I worked for the master of the desegregation suit that was in Delaware, and I worked with the master of the desegregation suit in Boston. And I was hired as a graduate student, to run a research project evaluating the second year of busing in Boston, a job for which I was deeply unqualified. And it basically involved my interviewing a lot of people who knew much more about statistics than I did. Our client was a interfaith nonprofit group. And I remember so distinctly saying to them, we've looked at the statistics. We could actually describe it as a success or as a failure. Which would you like? And it was at that point I decided, no, I'm not going to be a researcher. This is not adequate. But the reason we could characterize the results either way was it depended on the denominator or the numerator. That is, this was a period of white flight. So as whites left the public school system, the numbers who were there were so much smaller. You could characterize their spread through the system, through busing, as a success. But you could also characterize it as a great failure.
That play interesting mind games on
yes.
on how to do any kind of work.
Well, and a lot of the experience I had in graduate school was seeing that lawyers were much more directly involved in the questions I cared about, questions of educational equity, school finance, as well as desegregation. And I thought I better get a law degree out of self-defense just to be able to be at the table.
So was it that year with
Yes.
that experience that made you think that about?
Yes. Yes, I mean, I had other wonderful, formative experiences there. For example, with the team that put together Sesame Street, regularly came to the Harvard Graduate School of Education to get research help. And I worked with them on a show that became 3-to-1 Contact. And I learned there 2 lessons that ended up being so pivotal for me, especially when I was dean. So one lesson was We were assembled in teams that were very interdisciplinary, and I was the youngest person on my team. I had people who were mid-career and who were economists and who were actors and all kinds of things. But darn it, I was going to lead this team, and we were going to put in our proposal before anybody else, and we did. And the people at the Children's Television Workshop said to me, sometimes being first is not the most important thing. And maybe making sure that everybody in the team feels committed to the project and the result is more important. Oh, that was a revelation to me. I had never thought about that. And another lesson I learned there, besides the important role of research that's ongoing, formative research that informs what you're doing rather than just evaluative research, was they developed a technique that they called the yes day and the no day. So the brainstorming day for ideas, all that could be said was a yes, not a no, because their experience was the critical judgment would cut off the creative process. And then the next day, you bring all those ideas and look at them with a critical eye. And I certainly learned from that.
I'll ask something about this whole range of experiences that will come back probably repeatedly as we go through the rest. That you talked about being the youngest, maybe the youngest in this group.
Yes.
What was the sort of gender and racial makeup? Because that's sort of a recurring issue that comes up through, and maybe more especially turning into law and turning into the academy. But I wonder what your experience was like in terms of those demographics in those earlier experiences.
Well, I remember in college, I was in my senior year and I had never had a woman professor. And I had never had a professor of color. And I literally went through the catalog, and the catalog for the University of Michigan is many, many, many courses. And there weren't many options. But I found a woman, and I arranged an independent study with her, Marilyn Young, wonderful historian. And I found a fabulous professor of music, and I took a class in jazz. Most terrifying class I had in college was the jazz class, because the midterm required transcribing someone's improv, and the final was performing in a club. It was absolutely terrifying, but a great experience. But I remember very much thinking, I can't graduate with having only had white men as my professors.
And was it, how did you, there are a lot of people who go into those circumstances and are not, they're oblivious to that issue. What made you know that there was something missing? I know I'm asking you to think back a long time ago.
It's a great question, and I'm sure it had to do with growing up in the 1960s, as I did, and growing up in Chicago, going to hear Jesse Jackson speak, going to hear Martin Luther King Jr. speak.
Maybe only having sisters, too.
Only having sisters was absolutely big help, and having a mother who was, very supportive and engaged in public life, and a father who just, of course, we're going to have a voice and make a difference. But issues of injustice and social justice were very much the topic of conversations in my home. We were not observant, but we were engaged as Jews and went to synagogue, and again, social justice, very much a part of my upbringing. I had a rabbi growing up who organized bus rides to go to the South as part of the civil rights movement, and it really was years later that I realized that politics and religion are not the same, because I grew up that they were very much the same.
So then you ended up in law school at Yale. So any story about picking Yale?
So I was very torn. I was very lucky. I had options to go to many places. I didn't get into the law school at the University of Michigan, which was a little bit upsetting because I had gone to Michigan as an undergrad. But Harvard and Yale is where I really focused on. And I loved Cambridge, and I knew about exciting work going on in the clinics in particular there, and this new movement, critical legal studies, and was really torn about it, but ultimately went to Yale because I concluded, and this is the sentence I told myself, I'll have more time to read the work of people at Harvard if I go to Yale than if I go to Harvard. But just the then and now, I think the Yale Law School operates much more like a graduate school than it does a typical law school.
Oh.
And so I did go to Yale, and I remember the moment I used the word feminist to describe myself. It wasn't until law school, and it was in a criminal law class when rape was being discussed, and I found it a pretty outrageous discussion. And I previously had thought that race and class were the most important issues, and I decided, oh, I guess gender's pretty important too.
Male professor, female professor?
Oh, there were no female.
There were no female. That was another
Yes,
question.
yeah, there was one, yes, maybe there was one tenured woman and one untenured woman.
So where did you get that feminist? I guess it's sort of, there's a somewhat straight line from the past too on that, but to call yourself a feminist, you had to know about it, have thought about it, the label had to mean something.
Yeah, I don't think I was as informed as I should have been. Having sisters was helpful. My older sister certainly brought books home, brought The Second Sex home, and we talked about it, but I hadn't really studied anything related to it. She had. But I think it was, just a sense of right and wrong and justice and inequality and indignities.
And what other, you can talk a little bit more about law school and what it was like. How many women were there in the class?
I do remember that it was a big news that the school had broken 20%. So we had one small class, and there were 3 women. I was one of 3. And, it was very palpable. Big change from being in a graduate school of education, which was majority women and many people of color, and not so much in law school. Those 2 women on the faculty, I happened to have both of them in my first semester. And it was interesting to me, it did not escape my notice that of all the women who ended up on the Law Journal, disproportionately had similarly been in this small group that had both of them.
And who were the professors?
So Ellen Peters, who later became, Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, and Barbara Underwood, who later became Acting Solicitor General of the United States and now Solicitor General of New York. They were both very demanding and tough, and Barbara Underwood was up for tenure while I was there, and it was not a happy experience for her, and she left teaching.
So I was going to ask you about, to the extent you knew about their experience, or what, as a student, a very male class, mostly male professors, just a couple, what was that? I mean, do you have memories of things related to your experience in the classroom, their experience in the classroom?
Right. I just do remember noting that there weren't any other women to take classes from, and that was troubling to me. And I remember that, if we had any events where we were standing up, I was just very short. And I realized, because these are all men, no wonder. So I was not that enlightened, I guess, on gender issues, but it was a time of of awareness. I was very involved because of my work in education with children. So early on, in my first year, I wanted to do clinical work. I had a strong sense of service. I couldn't believe that I was just this self-indulgent person going to class, and so I did work in the clinic even as a first-year student. And another student and I started what is a clinic that's continued there, which is representing kids in court. And the fact that he is a man, I remember thinking, well, this is a good thing, because otherwise people think this is just women's work.
Were you then, so you talked about a sense of activism, turning from education to law.
Yes.
We have clerkship years to talk about, but were you thinking then about being a law professor, or
not at all?
Okay.
Yeah, not at all. I thought I'd be a civil rights lawyer, honestly. I took this work of representing kids in court. I was very interested in, representing people who don't have lawyers and the inequities involved with that. The work that I had done in college with a legal aid attorney, and I thought I would continue that, but I wanted to do something that might have a little more of a policy dimension. And my first job in the summer after the first year of law school was actually with a foundation. So I went back to Chicago. I worked for the Chicago Community Trust, and I was very interested in community-based work and how do you mobilize people in a community to do political work and social change work. So that was one avenue, and actually being involved in foundations has continued to be part of my life ever since that time. And I learned that summer about the possibility of bringing people together who otherwise won't talk to each other because there's the possibility of money. And being a neutral space. I mean, Chicago then and now is a very divided city, but people from all the communities would come to the foundation office. I also learned about the importance of surprisingly technical areas of law. So one of the assignments I was given that summer was to look at a series of trust funds that had been donated that to serve crippled children or children of Civil War survivors. Well, this is in the 1970s, and these were out of date. And so the concept of CRA, something I thought I didn't know. I hadn't taken trust and estates, and property law wasn't even required at Yale Law School. So I realized, oh my goodness, sometimes you have to actually draw on your legal background for things that are very technical, that have seemingly no relationship. But in order to open up these funds to make them available for, modern, contemporary children's rights issues, required that kind of legal analysis.
And then second summer, I think you worked at a law firm.
Did work at a law firm.
Yeah.
I wrote on to the law journal. There was no competition at Yale at that time other than writing on. And with that same colleague with whom we started this clinic on representing kids, we actually got foundation funding and did an empirical study about the role of lawyers representing children. This interesting problem, representing the person who by law will prevail, because the standard in these custody cases was the best interest of the child. So the problem was, what's your role representing the person who will prevail, who often is not competent? So we interviewed all the lawyers in Connecticut who represented children and wrote about that. So being selected for the law journal meant that I had this tiny sliver of a summer. And I went to a law firm for, I think it was 5 weeks. That was it. It was Covington and Burling. The wonderful man who recruited me, David Isbell, recruited me with this question. He said, what makes you think you can do well and good at the same time? And I thought, this is somebody I want to talk with. They took one look at me at the law firm. They handed me one case representing a community organization that had lost its HEW funding for being involved in community organizing and being too political. Another case was a student loan case that dealt with the savings and loan crisis that was going on at that time. And since I was the person on the team who had most recently taken contracts, it turned out I wrote the complaint. But it was my introduction to student debt and the big institutional problems contributing to it. So they, I think, didn't think I was going to stay a long time, but they treated me very well, and I've been able to advise students about going to private law practice, in part because of that experience.
So somewhere in here I have to figure out where you decided to be a law professor, and it might, I don't know whether it was before or during the clerkship years, but you had 2 phenomenal clerkships, one with David Bazelon at the DC Circuit, which is when we intersected, right?
Yes.
And then for Justice Marshall. So you could spend lots of time probably on either one of those experiences, but what were those experiences like? How did it affect you working with both those particular judges, but then at those levels, at those courts, with the people around you?
Well, as you say, what a remarkable experience. And you were with Judge Spotswood Robinson, one of my heroes, and from this civil rights movement for sure. Just having the chance to be with these people who had played pivotal roles, Judge Skelly Wright, another hero. David Bazelon was my boss, and David Bazelon was an unusual person. He had been chief judge and stepped down while I was there from that role. Very interdisciplinary. Someone who was most known at that time for his work in the insanity defense. He was deeply steeped into psychoanalysis and theories about mental states, but also, as I learned, interested in everything. My first weekend after I started work there, I got a call on at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. Would I write a marriage ceremony? And we're off to the races. Another assignment was to write a speech for the National Association of Engineers, and I learned about the role of redundancy in engineering and what is its relationship to judicial review. So it was a very fascinating year and experience. And just also seeing how judges who themselves had been involved in politics in one way or another hewed the line of law. The year that we were clerking, there were 4 new judges appointed, Abner Mikva, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Harry Edwards, and Pat Wald.
Right.
All of whom had had significant political experiences. Abner Mikva had been my congressman from Chicago. And talking with them, and they were candid about the transitions. That was very illuminating for me. And I remember distinctly one case in which both Judge Wright and Judge Bazelon were on the panel, so they could basically do what they wanted. I don't remember who the third judge was. And they said they were going to do something incredibly radical and told the clerks to draft something. And so we came up with something, and then they looked at it and they said, guess some things just don't write. And that for me was, wow, that was a wake-up call. Because these two, really lions of the law felt constrained by the law.
Did you have, it sounded like you had the opportunity to interact with a number of the judges.
I did.
My own judge was a quieter
one,
and
yes.
so we didn't have quite that of it. So
yes.
that
yes.
must have been extraordinary to, and talking to them about their transition, the new judges coming
yes.
on.
It was just a very unusual year, and because I think Bazelon was chief, they were in and out of the chambers a lot, and
right.
also he had a practice of going to lunch at the back office of a liquor dealer and bringing people, for corned beef or something, and would often bring the clerks. And so all of these new judges would come, and also some of the justices from the Supreme Court would come. So, and yes, I think, the fact that Pat Wald, Ruth Bader Ginsburg were there, I mean, I certainly did everything I could to see them, to figure out what was it like to be a woman in their positions. Mm-hmm. Pat Wald had 5 children. How had she done that and then had this career? I was utterly fascinated by that. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was already, heroic for what she had done for women's rights. So I was very fascinated. Harry Edwards has a labor leader I was very interested in, and Abner Mikva because of his work as a congressman. So yes, I was deeply interested in what they had done and how they were making that transition. And at one point, I had written my dad a long letter about the limits of being a judge. And I was talking with Harry Edwards about it, and he said, "Can I see the letter?" I said, "Sure." And he then quoted liberally from the letter in a speech that he gave. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you went and clerked with Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
So what was that experience like in contrast, in expansion?
Sure.
And
Sure. Well, first I'll tell about the job interview. I got called. I had a terrible cold. And I said to the clerk at the other end of the phone, could I postpone it? Long silence. One does not postpone an interview with Justice Thurgood Marshall. So I show up. I have tissues under one arm and a glass of water under the other. I'm coughing. I can really say nothing. And he said to me, my daddy had a cure for what you have. You take quinine and whiskey, and then you leave out the quinine. And then he said, you want the job? I said, yes. And I got the job. So, of course, He was my great hero. I had gone to law school because of school desegregation, and here was Thurgood Marshall. But the experience couldn't have been more different than the experience of clerking for David Bazelon. David Bazelon gave speeches a lot, had people coming in and out of the chambers. It was very interdisciplinary, as I mentioned. Law was there, but it was not his main focus. Justice Marshall was a lawyer's lawyer. He believed in procedure. I remember writing a memorandum about, a case that I felt strongly about. There was a statute of limitations problem for a complaint that I thought was compelling, and I thought that there should be an exception made. And he came back and he said to me, if we change the rules for this person, they won't be there when we need them. And I became a teacher of procedure, and that's something that I learned from him. Another time, I wrote a memo about a case that I cared deeply about. It was about deinstitutionalization of people with mental disabilities, an area that I went on to work in. And he came back through my memo on the desk and said, this is bleeding heart liberalism. It'll persuade no one, including me. Mm. So he was a much more, where's the law kind of person. He ended up writing a dissent in that case, actually, that reflected some of the things that I said. But that was the stance that he took. And also, he was a gregarious human being and told a lot of stories, but it was very inside of the law. And he was very dismissive of people, who were marching. Malcolm X, he was very dismissive of.
Times change over the, yeah. So where in this time period did you turn from thinking about being a civil rights lawyer, although there are aspects of that in the work you've done in the academy as well, but yeah, to going into teaching?
So retrospective recollection is very different than living life forward. It all looks much more coherent now than it felt then. When I was leaving law school, one of my heroes was a man named Robert Cover, who died young. He was 42 when he died, and I had edited one of his pieces for the law journal. I admired him. I took a seminar with him, and as I was leaving, he said, some of us here are talking about you going into teaching, and we couldn't see you here, and that was like a shock. Totally, I had never thought about it ever. I tucked it away, though. I interviewed for jobs at the Department of Justice. I was offered a job at the Civil Rights Division. It was my dream job. It was only torn between that versus the Office of Legal Counsel that I had never heard of before and wanted to understand it. But during my second clerkship, President Ronald Reagan was elected, and my car was towed the next day. I thought this is not going to be... Yes, it was symbolic. I thought this is not... I don't think that's the job that I want. I don't want to work at that Department of Justice. So then I started to look for other things. I had, we were at an interesting time when law schools were starting to think, we don't have any women on the faculty. So I went through a process that's so different than now. People called me up and said, would you think about being a law teacher? I didn't apply anywhere. I went and had interviews. People offered me jobs. I wasn't going to do what I planned to do, so that's what I did. I did go to one of those interviews with my fellow clerk, longtime friend, Stephen Carter, with whom I'd gone to law school.
Right, my co-clerk.
Stephen, African-American, actually the grandson of a lawyer. I mean, he really came from a very distinguished family. And we both were wondering while we were at the Supreme Court about law teaching, and we went jointly to an interview with the University of Virginia Law School. And the people interviewing us assumed we were a couple and said, nothing against you, but it wouldn't go over very well in Charlottesville to be who you are. That was a revelation. Yeah. So anyway, law teaching, I thought I'd do it for a few years. I thought, okay, there'll be a change in administration. I'll go back to Washington. And here I am 39 years later. Yeah. So the big change was somewhere in my second or third year. I was asked by the AALS to do some briefs. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts authorized a commission on violence against children. and didn't authorize any money for the commission, called me up and said, would you be the commission? There was a series of activities I could do that I thought, oh, I can do a lot of the things I wanted to do while I'm here.
You can do the advocacy
Right.
activist work at the same time.
Right.
So we'll come back to that. There's so much in your academic career. So I think we have to compartmentalize, or at least do it in pieces.
Sure.
So because there's teaching and mentoring students, there's scholarship. Then you used your scholarship in a variety of ways, but the scholarship itself and then the use of it, there's the community service
work, yes.
the outside. I mean, inside the law school service work, outside
Sure,
the so
sure.
so there's a lot there. But maybe we'd start with teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't come in thinking. I mean, you clearly had a connection to education. You
Yes.
got a master's in education.
Yes.
You cared about that. Was law school teaching different?
Everything that I had learned in graduate school of education was violated by law school. And I swore if I was ever going to teach, I was going to do it very differently. I mean, when I say everything, I mean really everything. The idea of using fear in the classroom, the idea of cutting off students while they're speaking. I learned in graduate school about kind of the circle of curiosity and anxiety that students go through and how to increase the curiosity and decrease the anxiety. And that's not how law school is operated. So I thought a lot about that.
Well, you also were at Harvard, so I mean,
Yes,
if there's any
yes.
place where that's less tough.
That is true.
I mean, it was
range.
always true about law school, but it was more
Extreme.
true about some schools.
Yes, extreme.
So how did you work in that environment?
It was a challenge. I mean, I will be frank. I mean, I learned very quickly that if I didn't establish authority in the classroom, I'd be eaten up alive. And my first year of teaching civil procedure, a course that I taught because I now understood the significance of procedure, one student said to me, "Did you even go to law school?" Another student said to me, "You're younger than I am. How can you teach me?" I mean, it was not the most enjoyable experience. My colleagues, who were all men who taught civil procedure, thought that they would have a weekly seminar on civil procedure for my benefit, and they smoked cigars and quizzed me about the subject. So it had its intense moments. The Harvard, going back there to teach, having not gone there to law school, it was, kind of a second chance because I had been torn about where to go to law school. Now I could teach at Harvard, and I also thought, though I had the chance to teach at Yale, I thought I want a different world. I want to learn as many new things in my first 3 years of teaching as I had in law school. I really loved law school. But Harvard was a tough place, and Harvard had denied tenure to a whole series of women. And so I really deliberated whether or not to go there. And I'll never forget Abe Shays, who was one of the faculty members who recruited me, one of the civil procedure people. I said to him, "But Harvard's not very good to women." And he said to me, "But you're tough as nails." And I thought to myself, I am not tough as nails, but something about the way he said it, I thought, well, I want to be that. I want to do that. So, but it was hard. I will not quibble about that at all. It was very hard. There was one tenured woman on the faculty. And
who was that?
Martha Field. And then there was one untenured woman, Betsy Bartholet, who called me up while I was debating whether or not to come and said, though she'd had a terrible experience and her pre-tenure period had been elongated and because her work wasn't good enough, it was all her fault. And I thought, this place is chewing up another woman. She later got tenure. She's done a terrific job in many fields. But I was worried about it, and I was right to be worried about it. It was not a place that was warm and supportive.
It changed over time, I imagine.
Yes.
How much of that? How long did it take? How difficult was it, and how much of a role did you play in, because if you were a third, there were two women there, one tenured, one untenured, you became tenured, and so you're pretty early in that process.
Yes.
So had to be part of the change.
Yeah, it's hard to keep it all straight. There was a sense at the school on the part of the faculty that they had a problem, and they started to hire more women. If any two of us were seen in the hall talking to each other, you live this.
Yeah.
The male colleague walks by.
You're all going to lunch together.
Yes,
what are you doing?
You're having a conspiracy about us.
Yeah.
We didn't even have ladies' rooms on every floor. I mean, so it was not, in the early days, it seems antiquated even to think about it. How
did you survive?
Yeah. I don't know. I think I was lucky. I was very lucky because I had enough of a group of untenured people, and we complained to each other and supported each other. And I had grown up in this family that, if things are unjust, you talk about it. And I remember I would talk in faculty meetings, and other people would come up and say, "You talked in a faculty meeting and you're untenured?" And I just thought, what's the point exactly?
So maybe Chase was right. You were tough as nails.
Well,
ultimately.
I don't know. I don't know about that, but I think I was ignorant actually about the consequences of doing what I was doing. But what I felt, if I saw something I thought was wrong, I did talk about it. So Jim Vorenberg became the dean. He was interested in civil rights and had been very involved in the NAACP. We had some connections on those issues. I think he meant to be supportive. He wasn't particularly, but I didn't think that there were people out to get me. But getting tenure was a fight, for sure.
What was your relationship like with students? Was it any different because of the gender you talked about in college teaching? You had two really sharp and and structured and challenging women. So, was your teaching different? Did students react well or not well?
Well, I did initially bring in fiction and poetry, and I learned very quickly that was not a good idea. That students thought where's the law? This is not real. So I did discover also that positioning myself as a critic of the system I was teaching was not going to be successful with the students. And that my challenge was to find the way to turn my criticisms into ways to equip them to be more effective as lawyers. And so not to trim my views, but to say this is a set of arguments that you can use inside the system as well as outside. So yes, I learned a lot about that. And teaching the required civil procedure class was a little baptism by fire, but I also taught from the beginning classes on children and the law and education and the law and family law, and those classes drew disproportionately women and people of color, and it felt like a very different enterprise, and there I experimented much more with techniques of instruction that I had learned about in graduate school or otherwise studied. Break into small groups, generate ideas. I will throw out to the class the possibility of calling on people rather than my calling on everyone. And then we'll talk about the dynamic that emerges. So I did experiment a lot with those kinds of efforts. And, Gary Bello, who was founder of our clinic, one of the people whose work had first drawn me to want to be at Harvard Law School, even when I was thinking about going there as a student, I just made a point. I want to know him. And we brainstormed and came up with the idea of combining clinics with classroom, which hadn't been done at Harvard before. And so I liked being able to experiment in that way.
Before we move on to governance, I noticed you visited over the course of, this is many years, you visited at a number of schools at Toronto, at least the ones I saw listed, Toronto, Boston College, Vermont, Hawaii, Northwestern. What was What did you draw from those experiences?
I never visited for more than, brief visits, so I never really picked up the whole family and moved somewhere else. But I really learned a lot from each of those experiences. And Boston College, I remember walking down the hall and hearing the word ethics coming out of a tax class and thinking, oh, that's different, and just thinking about a mission-driven school. That was very instructive to me, Catholic university. And I taught a class there that was related to the work I later did on genocide and human rights. And my students in the class were much older than the ones at Harvard, and they had more life experiences, and I really appreciated that and saw that they brought something to the class. They may not have been as sure of themselves analytically, but they brought a lot of wisdom, and I really valued it. In Hawaii, I learned that the students had an ability to listen to one another that was different than my students, and would very commonly, before making their own comment, say, I heard you saying this, is that right? And I thought, wow, we need to cultivate that much better. That is so admirable. And at Toronto, the law school at that time was run by a wonderful man, Rob Pritchard, who later became the president of the university. And when I was dean at Harvard, he was the chair of our visiting committee. And I just admired how he had a vision for the place, and a vision that was actually educating people from all over the world, and we talked a lot about that, and that had an influence on me. Vermont, out of the blue, called me up. They don't have a law school. And they just wanted me to be a professor at large, and okay, so I just met with undergrads. And
so that was the University of Vermont, not
yes,
Vermont Law School.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct,
right.
correct.
Yeah.
And there they wanted me more than anything to do sessions with their faculty, which I did.
Mm-hmm. And that was a while ago, or more?
It was a while ago.
It was a while ago. Our former dean ended up at Vermont, but
that's right.
That's more recent. So back at Harvard, and this leaps ahead a little bit, but I don't want to totally leave this gap. Starting in 2003, for a few years, you co-chaired the law school's Curricular Reform Committee. And that's an important moment, clearly, and I want you to talk about that, but I wonder if, from the time you started, we've talked about the difficulties, and it's very different, and the restrictions on teaching and how the effects on you, but somewhere between that, so it's 1981 maybe,
yes,
you're starting, and 2000, that's a long time period. So
yes.
How did things change for you in terms of your positioning at the law school? What
right.
kind of involvement did you have within the law school in terms of governance or responsibilities?
Well, I'll say something that's even about teaching. We had visitors, and I would often go sit in on their classes because they were different than my colleagues. So Catherine McKinnon was a visitor, and she taught in a different way than any of my colleagues, and I could not teach the way that she teaches. She is a charismatic, powerful presence. But I thought, oh, there's a wider range here, and that was significant. And I later became involved in the selection of visiting faculty members and chaired that committee. Early on, the deans asked me, they said, you have a background in education, would you be involved in our education committee, curriculum committee? So I did that periodically, but I don't think I had a major role, but I was not shy. I talked in faculty meetings, and I talked about faculty appointments, and I talked about curriculum, and I talked about admissions, and I don't know.
Then you get jobs.
Then you get jobs, exactly. And I, for better or for worse, I'm a reasonable person. So I was a reasonable person to put on a committee. I would be able to actually, back to that,
right.
Graduate School of Education, get a team to come onto an agreement. But now I understood actually it was important to have everybody contribute. And
maybe have yes days and no days.
Yes, exactly. Robert Clark became the dean. He was dean for 14 years. for the first time, I was put on hiring committees, hadn't been before. I was a reasonable left-wing person, so I was okay to put on the committees. I assume that's why I was on the committees, but I actually liked him a lot and admired him. So I was more in the operations of the school, but even before that, Jim Vornberg suggested I be on the admissions committee. And I remember he said to me, because someday, if you're ever dean, this would be a good experience. And I just laughed. It seemed to me such an outrageous thought. I was so much at the margin of this institution. But Elena Kagan became dean. Elena Kagan had been my student. Elena Kagan said to me, "You have to help me." I said, "I have no interest in administration," but yes, I became kitchen cabinet for Elena, and we talked about just about everything going on at the school. And she said, "There's one job I want you to do, which is curricular reform," and I said no 3 times. I said, "The world is littered with the carcasses of failed curricular reforms," but she is a persuasive human being. And
persistent.
And persistent. And finally I said, "Look, I'll do it on 3 conditions. 1, you have to co-chair it. It has to be one of your top priorities, so it's real. 2, there has to be no final report. Because the first year of my time as a professor, I went to faculty meetings where the Michelman report, authored by Frank Michelman, the result of many years of study of curricular reform, was target practice for the faculty and would never adopt it. I said, there can be no report. What we have to do is have a process. And at the end of the process, we either will have made a change or we won't. And the 3rd condition was a lot of food. I said there have to be a lot of meetings with a lot of food. And so that's what we did. We had dinners. And yes, it was an intense and interesting experience.
And what did you accomplish? No final report, I guess.
No final report, no. Really 3 big changes. The fundamental curriculum at Harvard had not really changed dramatically in over 20, 30 years, so it was well overdue. One change was to actually bring some new classes to the school. So one was a first-year course on legislation and regulation. And we,
Which now we've adopted.
Yeah, well, I mean,
because it was a good idea.
It was a good idea, but we don't live in a common law world, and it seems important for students to learn from the get-go. So, but we were beneficiaries of failed experiments at Penn and at Columbia, other places that had tried similar courses and it hadn't stuck. And Georgetown.
When I was a student there.
That's right. And we interviewed a lot of people. I learned about formative research. You talk to people before you do stuff. And we concluded, okay, we have to put the strongest teachers in that class. We have to come up with a common curriculum so that it doesn't look like it's random, and a series of elements. Similarly, we introduced a requirement of an international or comparative law class in the first year, that the map of the legal universe should not just be so insular. And we also added a much more practice-oriented experiential learning, or before we had that phrase, on problem solving. So that was one big thing, was to actually introduce new classes. Second was to say we can't wait another 25 years to have curricular reform. This has to be an ongoing process. And I'm really happy that my successor and friend John Manning has continued curricular reform and actually altered some of the things that I helped to lead, but that's absolutely right. And make it empirically based, testing it with not just students and their satisfaction, but also people in practice and what works and doesn't work. And the third was to focus on pedagogy as well. And that I felt, I had worked in education. So it is astonishing to me to this day that people are hired to be law professors having never learned anything about how people teach or how people learn, and more importantly, how adults learn. And adults learn differently than the way children learn. And people who are law professors are people who probably didn't have to work very hard at learning it. And many students, too, have to work harder. So anyway, we made that a commitment as well, and have worked now with many different kinds of approaches on how to equip the faculty to understand different learning styles and different ways to teach.
Any disappointments or frustrations out of that process?
Yes, of course, of course, and also learning from it. So, the numbers of minutes devoted to common law were so many compared to the role of the common law. So to have courses in contracts and torts and property as distinct when their subjects actually overlap, and also not to actually connect the vocabulary or the concepts across the courses. So we had a proposal to make a contorts class or a common law class and reduce the number of credits. And it did not happen. And I very, kind of sheepishly went in to talk to Elena, and I said, look, this is not going to happen. I'm walking the halls. It's not going to happen. And she said, keep it on the table. I said, what? She says, keep it on the table, and it's one of the options, and it'll alter the way we have the conversations. And she was right. And the fact that that was there, as might happen, led to some of the other reforms. So that was a frustration. It's still a topic of debate to this day. This is many years later. Where maybe property will move out and not be required. I don't know. And then, another frustration was I love the clinics. I believe in the clinics, and their separation from the mainstream is, something I had worked on as a classroom teacher, and I still wanted to do more on that. And we weren't able to do much more on that, and I think that continues to be a problem. Many frustrations, but yeah.
So that was like 3 years.
Yes.
And then in 3 years later, you become dean of the law school. So how did you end up there from the reaction of like, dean would never be?
So Elena Kagan left for a better job. She was initially appointed to be Solicitor General of the United States, and even then, several of us thought and hoped that she might become a judge. I had actually served on the transition committee for candidate Obama on the judiciary, and so of course it was the right thing for her to do. I really didn't want to be dean. People asked me if I wanted to be dean. I said no many times. I was offered it. I turned it down. But it was the financial disaster time in the country, and it was a terrible time at law schools. So
that made you agree?
Not at all. Not at all. But I have a strong sense of duty, and at that point, the president of Harvard was Drew Faust. The idea that there would be a woman president, and she'd be asking not just one woman to be dean, but this was going to be a second woman dean, that was important to me. But also, I thought there were going to have to be cuts of the budget, and I would rather it was my values that were guiding those cuts. So I became dean.
So aside from, so you had to deal with the finances. You can talk a little bit about that and how that played out, but what else, what goals,
Yes.
I mean, there's the
managerial
dean,
and
right.
Yeah.
So deans can manage and allow the faculty to thrive, or they can lead, or some of both. So
right.
Well,
so I said to Drew Faust, I don't know who should be dean. I don't really want to be dean, but I do think that the question you, as the president of this university, should have in your mind is, what's the relationship between the law school, which is a significant institution in the country and in the world, and justice? And why is it called a law school and not a justice school? So she reminded me of that many, many times. So that was clearly something I cared a lot about. Not that any particular view of justice should be determinative, but it should be the constant conversation. I felt strongly about that. I had never led anything. I'd been a chair of a nonprofit board, but no, never really. I'd never managed. I'd only managed 1/3 of one faculty assistant. That's all I had ever managed, other than being the head of the evaluation of the second year of busing in Boston. I really hadn't run anything. So I sat down and I read a lot of leadership books, largely from Harvard Business School, and articles, and I found there were 3 models of leadership. One was the cowboy, one was the shepherd, tends to the flock, and one was the beekeeper that came out of the software industry, which is someone who makes sure that the bees have what they need and then leaves them alone. And what struck me was that these were all describing non-humans. And these were not going to be helpful to me, because one of the big challenges of being a leader in a university or a college context is everybody thinks that they're the boss and they're the leader. So I threw out all the leadership books and drew more on my experiences as a mother, frankly, as someone working in community organizations, as a teacher. Really thought of myself often, how do you lead the class to an insight rather than give them the insight? Kind of making it up as I went along, because I hadn't had a model like that.
And you were dean for like 8 years, so yeah. That's a pretty successful.
It was a long time.
It was a long time. So what would you say your biggest accomplishments were? And that can be, there's the getting certain things done. There's also, sure. There's personal and there are lots of ways to understand what that might mean. What are you proudest of? I guess might be a different way of asking from your time as dean.
That's a really good question. I am...
Or proud of. I don't want to put too much of a...
There were the very practical issues. We literally had a hole in the ground that had been dug for a new building, and a hole in the budget that was the same size. The endowment lost 30%, lost all the money that had been raised for the building. So my first week, we had to decide, are we going forward with the building? We built the building. We refinanced. I toned down some of the expenditures. That just being a fiscally prudent person, but also I just decided this is not something that the faculty should worry about. And I basically played mother, and I did not share pretty dire projections. University constantly asking me, what's your plan if we lose another 30%? And tell us what you're going to cut. It really was pretty scary. But I thought there's no point in bringing the faculty into that. Those are ifs, and we don't know. And just tried to portray that we were in charge and we were going to manage. And I did say often we have the most important assets. We have the people, and we have great students and great faculty, and we will deploy them better. Don't let any crisis go to waste. Find ways to have cuts. We had a wonderful interim dean who actually made many of the toughest cuts, but again, my first week, I restored the funding for feminine hygiene products in the bathrooms. I couldn't believe that those had been cut, and similarly for translators in the clinics. But those are the only two things I reversed. And so one area is that. Another is I just, wanted to break the back of our failures to diversify our faculty. It had been awful for a long time. We had been stuck at 12, 13 women out of 100 for a long time. And, Lonnie Guinier, my dear friend, first woman of color on the faculty, was tired of being the only one. Derek Bell had a sit-in fasting. I used to bring him, meals or something as he's sitting in his office because there were not enough women of color on the faculty. So that was a goal I had, and we did change the composition of the faculty. I didn't announce the faculty were going to do this, we just turned out there were some very good people we could hire. And, when some people said, well, we just hired a black woman, I said, there's another one who's really good. It's not, we don't say that about a white man. We just hired one. Somehow we were able to hire another one. So yes, and that also involved expanding the clinical faculty and creating a category of professor of practice. I thought that could bring in people with important experiences. Other schools had begun to do something similar, and I also thought we might be able to bring in people who would add to our diversity if we did that. So faculty and faculty development. I mean, I just made it a point to do something no dean had ever done with me, which is meet with every faculty member about their research and their teaching and what's their plan and what are they working on and how can we do more and how can we make the most of our great resources here. And you know, I'm gratified when I see now a faculty member who said, you know, I remember that conversation and you said I could do something more ambitious and here's what I've done, and that feels good. I did feel very strongly that the justice mission, you know, we really need to be putting that forward and not crying about Harvard Law School has to cut some of its budget. People are in much worse shape than Harvard Law School. And so what could we do? And how could we, you know, expand not just the clinics, but certainly the clinics, but other kinds of activities. And so, you know, I think we've done more. That's a long conversation. And interdisciplinary ties, that's another one. I mean, it's been a strong interest of mine forever. Every problem that is hard requires more than one discipline to solve it. And having worked in education and on issues about children and people with disabilities and international issues, I just know you need economics, you need psychology, you need history. So I spent a lot of time at a very decentralized university building ties across departments, across schools, and then outside of Harvard to make collaborations.
So I'm reminded of your stories from your first years there of the civil procedure teachers sitting down and now you're in this leadership role doing something entirely. And I know from my own experience, over time, some people aren't there anymore, and that's part of a change. Do you think that the faculty and students have changed over time to be more, or I mean, were you the product of who you are and the change, or the change agent to help lead them into this new space?
You know, I have loved history as a field forever. It's what my undergraduate major was. When Elena Kagan became dean, I had to adjust my prior view that one person can't make history, because she made a big change in our institution. And she just said, we're going to do things differently, and we're going to put students at the center of the experience. No dean had ever done that. And yeah, we're going to actually have a gym for the students, not in 5 years. We're going to have it in the fall. And, you know, just very big ambitions. And so I was clearly a beneficiary of what she had done, and also wanted to consolidate and expand on many of the things she had done. You know, she was able to do some of the things she did because she had help, like from people like me. But everything that I did, I had help as well. I felt one of the things I was proudest of was to cultivate some others to be leaders. I didn't want to be dean for a long time, and to cultivate people as deputy deans or in other kinds of roles so that they could actually take up leadership roles, and also to empower great administrators who just kill themselves all the time and recognize them, and to say, yeah, you know, here's what I think we should do, but I'm going to leave it to you to come up with the details. And again, that lesson from the time that I worked with the Children's Television Workshop, actually everybody being invested is really an important part of getting something done. So I think that was somewhat new, because, you know, every prior dean had been stylistically more authoritarian, and I'm not. You know, I've made decisions. I don't have any trouble making decisions, but where possible, make it more collaborative. You know, I guess I'm proud that I was able to still have my values and still have friends and be a human being as dean. And, you know, I'd been very involved in my daughter's school, and there was a head of the parent-teacher group who was always at the school, who just killed herself for the school. And finally, a group of us went to her and said, you can't do this anymore. It's not just for you, it's that no one will take this job again. because of the way that you're doing it. And that, for me, was a guide as I took on this role, that I want to model, this is a job that you can have and be a human being. And Rob Pritchard, I mentioned before, from the University of Toronto, was very helpful, because I was debating, can I take this job? I have aging parents, I have a child still at home, how am I going to do any of this? And he said, you'll model for people what it is to do that. And I thought about that a lot. So that was important to me.
So one last question about sort of the law school world before we turn to sort of external things, and that's your role at the AALS, sort of outside Harvard, in creating the Dean's section, right? How did that happen, and what? I mean, that's sort of an important community building.
Sure.
For across
Absolutely.
the law schools. So
Absolutely. So Judy Areen became the executive director, and I've known Judy forever. In fact, when I worked for the Select Committee on Education for John Bradamus in the Congress, Judy Areen had worked for him as well, and so we met. And then later when I went into family law, and she was in family law, so I'd known her a long time. And she and I were talking about this crisis period for law schools. And if it was hard for Harvard, it was hard for every law school, and the drop in applications, and, you know, would there be jobs for students? And we talked about the deans needing a place to talk with each other about ideas. And I mean, it was really Judy's idea, but I certainly absolutely agreed with that. And, you know, the AALS has been, for me, always very welcoming. I mean, early on, I became the chair of one section and then a chair of another section, and law and literature, law and community, marginal sections, but really great people. And having friends and colleagues across the country, very important to me. You know, most law schools can't afford to have more than one person of a certain type. So you're more likely to find people at other schools who do similar kinds of work. And so the ALS was always great as a support. So of course I wanted to be helpful. But most people who are at Harvard had not been involved in the ALS. And it seemed to me important. It seemed to me important to be there. It seemed to me important to be at the ABA. It seemed to me important to be involved in legal services, you know, that if I have any resources here, they include, you know, using this platform or this position and say this matters. And to, you know, there were some deans of elite law schools who basically said, well, we don't have problems. The problem's the way at some of these other law schools. And I just didn't have that view. I thought this is a sector we ought to be talking together. I had lots of friends at a lot of law schools, and, you know, the law schools in the Boston area were really hurting. So it seemed important, and find what we had in common, and to make the case for law, the rule of law. It's kind of hard to imagine that we have to do that at this moment, when I think the recognition of the significance of law and lawyers has grown considerably. But at the time, you know, Judy and I talked about how do we make the case that the rule of law matters and that lawyers matter.
So last kind of big, and it is a big topic all on its own, are things you've done outside the academy. And you know, there's a list of engagements. You've mentioned some of them already. So instead of, I may ask about some in particular, but
Sure.
But maybe the better way in, or a good way in, is to just ask a more open-ended question about what are the most important engagements of that kind for you over the years.
Well, I have a strong sense of duty and a sense of, you know, there's just outrageous injustices in the world. So I was always looking for opportunities. But I've been incredibly lucky to have, you know, opportunities thrust upon me. So I get a call one day, would I be willing to put my name, and if it were funded, my time, into a project that the Department of Education, the federal department, was going to fund to implement a federal law of opening up access to the curriculum, kindergarten through high school, for kids with disabilities. Well, I had worked in this field. I cared a lot about it. The organization that was proposing it, I really believed in. They used new technologies to enable anyone who had voluntary control of one muscle to be able to read and create texts themselves. And so I really believed in what they did. I had already been involved with them. And so I said yes. And they got the money. So day one, I think, oh, I know this field. I'm going to teach educators and administrators about how to implement the law. Day two, I learned that's not what this assignment is. Day two, there's a copyright problem the minute that you copy anything and digitize it. And day three basically was, and there's an antitrust problem if you bring together the publishers to talk about it.
It's back to CPRE.
Completely was. Oh my gosh, I have to look at every tool in the toolkit. And that for me was, actually very influential in the way that I teach and the way that I communicate to students about what it is you need to do while you're in law school. And yes, we did develop a wonderful set of ideas and a little community organizing. We got the different groups of advocacy groups that didn't want to meet with each other to talk with each other, and developed voluntary standards that the department liked so much that they proposed them to be a rule. They became mandatory standards, and then the department gave us more money. And so that was, that was a great experience. A woman came up to me at a meeting and said, I've read a book of yours. I said, well, that's you and my mother have read this book. That's very nice. It turns out she ran an organization she had founded called Facing History and Ourselves that addresses how do you build a kind of democracy and prevent genocide. It had grown out of Holocaust experiences, but also slavery, and how do you build the kind of bulwark of a civil society against dehumanizing others. So she found value in my work. That was wonderful, very nice, and she kept calling and asking me to help. And over the years, I actually started running their conferences. And one of the conferences was addressing mass atrocity and genocide. And we had a year of just talking with people all over the world about how we should run this conference. And I decided to summarize what we had learned. And it was, we'd have 3 parts of this conference. One looked at international criminal trials. One looked at truth commissions. It was 1995 or so, where the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission had just started. And the last strand would look at reparations. So we had the conference, and it was wonderful. We brought the last living prosecutors from Nuremberg. We brought the prosecutors of the then new ad hoc tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. And we brought some of the formative people from the Truth Commission and people involved in reparations. And then we had a debrief, and everyone said, well, somebody has to write this up. Who's going to write the book? And then everyone looked at me, and I wrote a book. So I wrote this book. I get a call out of the blue. Hello, I'm the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and I've read your book, and I think you can help us. And I said, I don't know anything about refugees. I don't think so. And she was persistent. And Madame Ogata from Japan, remarkable political scientist, recently passed away. I ran a project on how do you promote coexistence in the course of doing refugee work rather than exacerbate conflict. And was just so lucky to be able to draw on other relationships with lots of friends, brainstorming. I didn't know anything, but to bring people together in how do you use arts and sports and finance and, so we did that. So a series of these projects, I feel a lot of it was luck. And what's been most important to me is, to actually leave something more than just do this project. Let's create a community that has some enduring power.
And that grows out of, you described 2 instances of someone saying, I read your book. And so the scholarship, which often seems dancing on the head of a pin in some ways, yours has spoken to people in a way that opened these opportunities.
I mean, so lucky. And another call on the same book, I got a call from Justice Richard Goldstone from South Africa, who not only had read my book, he wrote the introduction to it because Facing History folks asked him to. I'd never met him. He agreed to do it, very generous. He calls me up and he says, the government of Sweden is authorizing a commission on Kosovo, and was the humanitarian intervention lawful? And would you be on the commission? I said, I have a sabbatical. No, I'm not going to be on the commission. He said, I'm taking a leave of absence from the Constitutional Court of South Africa to be on this commission. I think you could be on it. And I went on the commission, and it was, totally fascinating, extraordinary experience, and it was because he liked the book. So, yeah. And then, I've been lucky enough to then write about the things that I've been learning about through these hands-on experiences. And that, for me, has always led to the best work, where I have a experiential dimension to it. I understand something about the phenomenon, not just intellectually.
You've also done, I don't think that this is a different aspect of it. You've written, I mean, I've signed various amicus briefs, but it seems that you've been more engaged and really written amicus briefs in significant cases, and I think some of the desegregation. So just talk a little bit about that, the importance of that.
Right. Well, I really think there's power and limits on the use of litigation to make changes. Sometimes it's more defensive than it is really opening up something new. But even from the time I was an untenured person, that was something I wanted to do. And also have had, great opportunities with colleagues. So Larry Tribe, Kathleen Sullivan, to be able to work with these absolutely stellar people, and how do you make an argument, and how do you put it together, and how do you frame it. It's so connected to what I write about, what I work on intellectually, but also, in some areas, when same-sex couples were not in the current legal status that they have now, real jeopardy for child custody. And so I wrote amicus briefs in that area, and different organizations would call me, and I have done work like that. Yes.
So an almost final question is how have you done so much? It's kind of the balance question. I mean, you talked a little bit. I haven't asked about I asked about your birth family,
Right.
the family growing up. I haven't asked about you mentioned your daughter. You've done an enormous amount. You've talked about how to do leadership within the law school. You've talked a little bit about that balance, but how, and in some ways it's a little bit about your own experience, and then advice for others who are trying to put together busy professional lives, maybe with you've got advocacy and scholarship, an enormous amount. I mean, I didn't even ask you about all the scholarship, because in some ways that speaks a little bit more for itself, because it's all written down. So, but you've done an enormous amount of that, and then you've done the leadership at your school. You've done all this service. So
you're embarrassing me, but
well,
the scholarship, I don't know what I think until I write it. So for me, it's just an essential part to figure out what I think. And the freedom to own your own mind, the gift and the privilege of the job that we have, I never take it for granted that I don't have a client that makes me not say what I think. But I don't know what I think until I write it down. So, I'm writing a book right now, and I'm sorting through what I think. So, I think that, it was certainly helpful to have had a journalism background, so that you have the experience of, you just have to produce a draft. It's not perfect, but it's got to be out because there's a deadline, and I think that has served me well. It's helpful not to need a lot of sleep. That is for sure true. It's helpful to have, great family. I have an incredible husband, and who happens to also be a law professor. And an incredible daughter, and great parents. And my sister said to me, that there's, I said, you must have worked it out perfectly. You're part-time in your job and you're home with your kids the other days. And she said, there's no perfect job. There's no perfect way to do this. It helped to have others in the family and other friends just to be able to say, no, it's not going to get back to normal. This is the new normal. You're going to have chaos, and it's going to be something you're not going to always feel in control of. I think that my advice to others, and I do often, I spend a lot of time with younger people, and it's very gratifying. Just on the way here, somebody stopped me and said, thank you for mentoring me. And, it's an incredible, gratifying experience to be able to work with young people and influence their lives. When I was in graduate school and had my first class in psychology and realized, oh my gosh, there's as big a world inside of a human being as there is in history and economics and philosophy. Oh no, now what do I do? And, I thought, well, maybe someday I'll teach people who will have an influence in policy and politics. And, the day that President Obama, appointed Elena Kagan to the Supreme Court, and I was at the White House for that event, and they were both my students, I still pinch myself. That was kind of incredible. But there are many people who are not as famous who, just are so gratifying to see what they've done and where they are and what they're doing now, and pass it on. And my advice to people is to admit your fallibility and never pretend that it's all under control, and be willing to ask for help, and be open to learning, and as much as possible focus on the parts of the work that are gratifying so that you will give it your all.
Well, I was going to ask if you had any final, but that's I think a good place to stop. I mean, it's a message it's a description of what you've contributed, and
thank you,
and what you mean to many who you've mentored. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the wonderful questions.